Hi, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining this session today, in which we're looking at covering the Learning Outcome 2 for the unit research project. Now, with regards to our journey on this particular unit, let me do a quick recap in terms of what we covered yesterday. We started this unit off and discussed, the first learning outcome and the basic reasons behind why do we look at carrying out research. Now, there were a couple of things which were discussed in terms of, looking at how to look at formulating a research question, a research proposal, looking at a timeline, which can be depicted using a Gantt chart, and then also looking at, collating material, which can definitely be used, for the purposes of conducting a literature review, which is nothing but a set of existing, let's say, material which is currently published, present, available for us to be able to look into that problem or the issue that we are looking at further investigating by undertaking a research project. And then towards the end, we also looked at a broad structure in terms of how we would go about putting the proposal together. And this proposal is basically using a template that I've created, and I've uploaded that on Moodle, which is shared with you. And that allows you to go through in a structured manner of how to look at formulating a research question, looking at basically the rationale of research first, then going into aims and objectives, looking at the rationale of why you want to carry out the research. Then once you've decided the aims and objectives of the research, we also then look at formulating what is called the hypothesis. Should we look at testing a statement, and should we look at doing a research to undertake to try and prove or disprove that particular statement? We create a hypothesis relating to the main factors of research. And then once we've decided how we are going to go about doing it, we basically look at the existing literature, existing material, which is available primarily from books, articles, journals, published research, to try and establish what has been done in this particular domain or in the area of your interest for which you're carrying out research. Then we look at discussing the methodology, which could be done through Research Onion. And I've also again shared a handout on Research Onion, which basically gives in detail the work which was produced by Saunders and his team. And this is now widely recognized. The three circles that we talk about in terms of research strategy, philosophy, we look at the ways in which you will go about conducting research: qualitative, quantitative, inductive, deductive, or a mixed approach. Qualitative, quantitative, or a mixed approach, and then towards the end, how you go about doing the data collection and then interpreting that data, analyzing that data to be able to then present meaningful conclusions and recommendation. Now, in today's learning outcome, going further from here, today's learning outcome is more focused on, so the first one was mostly theoretical. You wanted to understand what is research, reasons of doing research, how to formulate a research proposal, go about creating some sort of a structure of how you would undertake that research. Now, we are looking at doing this in the context of health and social care. So the idea would be here to try and pick out topics, which are close to you and you have a good understanding of. And we are looking at doing a desk-based research or secondary research and creating a secondary research project, which will be then evidenced as assignment for this particular unit. Now, in the second learning outcome, we are looking at be able to. That means you are going to be able to practically required to do and undertake some part of this research, and some of the assessment criteria which we have to look at, satisfying in studying the learning outcome to include matching the resources efficiently to research question or hypothesis. So we look at in a bit more detail today in terms of what is a research question and what is a research hypothesis, and we look at one or two different types of hypotheses which are generally used to construct the rationale of the research and then test it, by either undertaking the activities to try and prove it right or disprove it in terms of the conclusions that you want to reach for the investigation or research that you're carrying. We'll also look at undertaking the proposed investigation, which is in accordance with agreed specification and procedures. Now, one of the most important things that we look at when we start to undertake a research, what we need to do is get a sign off on what has been agreed in terms of the aims and objectives of what would the research investigation cover. Now, the reason of taking this sign off is to also ensure that when I say the sign off, first we need to look at designing the specification, limiting it to some major objectives, some micro objectives, and then having a sign off on this, so that when we carry out the research, we are carrying it to meet those objectives, and then towards the end, we are able to come out with a meaningful conclusion. The third assessment criteria will look at focusing on recording and collating relevant data which is appropriate for the research. Now, there are lots of ways through which we can do data collection. I have added a few slides towards the end of the presentation in order to ensure that you understand how data collection is done, what are the various processes through which we can collect data, and when we choose the type of research and you design your research strategy, whether you go with qualitative, quantitative research, or a inductive, deductive, or a mixed approach. The idea in this case would be to try and understand how data is collected, how data is analyzed, and then some of the statistical tools like SPSS. We use a lot of different types of tools today in order to analyze large amounts of data which is collected. It has to be collated, it has to be analyzed, processed, and then meaningful conclusions from that data have to be interpreted to come to basically relate to the outcomes of the research and research objectives. So this is what we will be looking at discussing today in Learning Outcome 2. And let me switch you over to the presentation. Now, in this Learning Outcome 2, we are looking at primarily covering, which is the topic focused on being able to implement the research project within agreed procedures and to the specification. So when we look at in general, when we look at looking at covering this particular learning outcome, we are looking at three aspects of it. One is implementation, second is data collection, and the third part being data analysis. So I've added a few slides which will basically give you an example of how implementation is done, how collection of data is done, and then how do we look at doing the analysis towards the end. Now, before I start, I want to look at some key terminology, which is basically to try and refresh in terms of what we've discussed yesterday with regards to the research question. So if you recall, what we discussed yesterday was, when we talk about what is a research question is basically what you're trying to answer. It is the topic, it is the main objective of why you're carrying out the research or the investigation, or you're undertaking a set of activities to basically uncover the reasons behind a particular event or a happening which is particular happening in the background. Now, that question, which is the centerpiece of your research, is basically defined as the research question, and this helps you formulate a research topic or a title, and this is reflected throughout the activities and the data that you collect in your research report. So towards the end, when you present your findings, there is a triangulation which is to be done in terms of your research aims and objectives. It has to be looking at, drawing out meaningful conclusions from your literature review and the findings or the data that you've collected either through research questionnaires, surveys, in-depth focus interviews, things like that. And they all need to be triangulated to come out with some meaningful conclusion. And this is the most important bit, wherein we have to be very specific about what you're going to undertake for the purposes of investigation. And generally speaking, you do not have more than 2 research questions as the topic. In that case, when you're trying to do or undertake research becomes too complex. So research questions are generally, in most cases, I would say the research questions tend to be 1. And in some cases, the overarching research question can be broken down into 1 or 2 or more objectives, and they then tend to define what is called the area of research that you're going to undertake. Now, if I look at what is hypothesis is a statement that you either are going to prove or either are you going to disprove by undertaking the research investigation that you're doing. So in this case, when I talk about a hypothesis tends to be a situation wherein you're going to look at let's put it this way, make a statement, and that would then be either backed up by theory. You'll do some research going into the background of looking at, how an educated guess. So when I talk about, say, for example, hypothesis, where we are going to be looking at comparing that with the research question that has been set. So hypothesis generally tends to be predictive in nature. It is going to be looking at, establishing a relationship between your dependent and your independent variable. It is going to be looking at, asking you to dive into the existing literature or existing published material which is available, and then you're going to try and find out, or let me say, fish out material or data which is related to your research question or the research that you're undertaking. And you're going to be then looking at undertaking experimental studies, whether it's going to be either through qualitative route or quantitative route. And these studies would either go ahead and prove or disprove the statement that you have made when you have looked at creating a conceptual framework, and that is testing, the relevance of what has been made as a statement, which is nothing but a hypothesis, when you undergo and when you basically undertake this research or you go about conducting the research. Now, when I talk about hypothesis, it starts with your research question. And that is what the hypothesis is meant to be. It is going to be able to answer or provide answers to the research question that you have set. So that is why your research question needs to be very focused, very specific, and it should be researchable within the constraints of the research project or activities that you're going to undertake to carry out your project. Now, there are two different types of, hypotheses which are generally very common that we have seen. So one is the chi-squared test hypothesis. Now, this is generally a statistical hypothesis which is used to analyze basically contingency tables when the sample size is very large. The definition of it, which you need to understand, that this is something which we look at primarily when you have large sample size in terms of data. That means if you're going to collect 2,000 data from 2,000 participants when clinical studies happen, and I yesterday quoted the example of COVID, the final trials of the vaccine were done on 30,000 patients or volunteers, and all the details in terms of symptoms, reactions, were noted down, and obviously then it was declared. If there were no major symptoms observed, then the vaccine was declared, the tests were declared successful, and that then allowed, essentially, the vaccine to be rolled out. So when we look at such large numbers in terms of sample size, then that is when we are looking at, conducting a hypothesis or using a hypothesis test, which is called the chi-squared, hypothesis. Now, the chi-squared hypothesis generally tends to be used when we are analyzing, as I mentioned, large sample sizes or large data. Now, this is primarily used as a test to check categorically two variables and whether they are influencing the outcome of the research or not. So in this case, it is a popular, technique which is used especially when you carry out research, and if you're carrying out research with across a large sample data, wherein you would need to then analyze the results of the data collected from the participants, and then you could use chi-squared test to be able to test your hypothesis. The null hypothesis, on the other hand, is basically, it is denoted by HO and H1, which is what you will generally get to see when we talk about this hypothesis. So in this case, it is basically going to be testing the results of your research on two possibilities. And that would be these two possibilities, which are primarily going to be whether this is possible or whether this is not possible. So it is going to either prove it right or either prove it wrong. And null hypothesis generally helps us identify claims, or say, for example, theoretical claims, or let's put it this way, theoretical claims which have been made in the past, but there is not enough evidence against these claims to be able to prove that they are correct. So in those cases, you would use the null hypothesis, and here it suggests that sometimes there is no statistical relationship and significance between what has been mentioned and what has been observed in terms of collection of data. So generally, you would look at a sample size and you would say if there is enough evidence to, let's say, collect, and that enough evidence which is collected then is able to prove, and help you prove certain parts of your research. And if there is not enough evidence collected and there is this evidence which has been collected is not enough to prove, the objective that you're trying to undertake in terms of investigation, then in those cases we end up rejecting, the claim or the data which has been put in the past, and that would be looking at understanding through the processes of, looking at using null hypothesis. Now, null hypothesis is generally used because when you're trying to test and conclude whether or not there is a relationship between two measured phenomena. So if you have two variables and you're trying to create a relationship in short between to find out whether these two are related or not related, then in that case you would use null hypothesis because it will come out with a clinical answer. Either it is there, one, or it is not there, which is zero. So with this broad understanding, let's get into some of the assessment criteria which are related to learning outcome 2 that we want to discuss today. Now, the first one talks about match resources efficiently to research question or hypothesis. Now here, one of the key things, as I mentioned just now, was that your hypothesis needs to be, related to your primary research question. So here, what we need to be able to do is when we try and put together research objectives, we need to be able to make sure that we have enough resources and our conceptual framework or the hypothesis that we have built is going to sufficiently go and test those objectives when we carry out that research. So in this case, what we are looking at is we are looking at complying with some of the ethical boundaries or considerations which we need to take into account. Because sometimes when you send out this information to participants who you are inviting them to ask them to participate in your research or help contribute by providing data to your research, then you would need to comply with certain ethical considerations. That means the data, when it is published, it is anonymized. Data, when it is published, is not publishing or disclosing personal information about a particular participant. The data needs to be credibly protected in the sense that it should not reveal the identity or personal preferences of the participant who has participated and then agreed to go along with the research. So in this case, when we talk about ethical considerations, it could be related to resources. You're not looking at getting favorable, answers from the participant by offering them some incentives, things like making sure that you're staying within the boundaries of any legislation which is applicable in order to conduct your research. And then you are also giving due credit to people who are participating, contributing data or any sort of support which they are providing towards this particular research report that you are compiling. They all need to be considered into the ethical boundaries or ethical considerations essentially when carrying out research. Ethical boundaries tend to be that you are going to professionally conduct the research. You're not going to be biased. You're not going to be seeking or disclosing any form of data which is not related to the research question or research topic directly. And in this case, also looking at preserving the identity of the individual who has participated in the research, and as a result, keeping the identity, let's say, not revealing details about the identity of the participant, which is where you're then protecting the data and respecting the dignity and individuality of the participant who has come in and willingly then participated in the research. So this is about matching your resources, looking at ethical considerations, ethical boundaries, and at the same time looking at ensuring that you are staying within the remit of the research question, formulating it towards and relating it to your hypothesis, and then going about conducting the research in a meaningful manner, which will allow you to efficiently conduct the research and then also stay within the remit of finding data or investigating and collecting data which is directly going to be related to the research aims and objectives and the title of your research. Now, the other thing that we also look at is that the researcher in this case should also be aware of their legal responsibilities. That means any such responsibilities which are going to be required by law when you undertake certain research, when you look at speaking to participants, when you say, for example, publishing the research, what are the various regulations and regulatory, let's say, conditions that you need to be aware of. You also need to be aware of, conducting research. Sometimes research involves practical applications, like in the case of COVID, as I mentioned, that involved the patients volunteering. When I say patients, I would use the word volunteers, volunteering to basically take the vaccine when it was not even proven and launched. But they volunteered in return, and they were given very details of the terms and conditions, any repercussions they could face, or any sort of ill effects which could happen because of the taking of the vaccine. All this was explained, and in some cases, financial compensation is also provided, so that if the tests are to go, are not to come out as planned, then in those cases, any such expenses which are incurred by the volunteer to be to get back, to get well, or to get back to its original health and condition, are covered by the company which is undertaking or asking the volunteer to come in and take that vaccine. So in these cases, you're looking at also being aware of certain actions which might be required, both from a financial aspect, from a legal aspect, to be taken if the results or the tests in this case do not go as planned. So you have to consider and obviously respect the decisions of all participants. If they refuse to participate, do not want their data to be divulged, or if they withdraw midway through the investigation or the research that you're carrying out, you will have to look at respecting those decisions, and they are what are to be looked at when you undertake your research. So you are effectively looking at creating or shortlisting a sample size or a list of participants that you will go across to in a very structured way, collect that data. Once that data is collected, you're analyzing the data, anonymizing it, making sure you're respecting the individuality, dignity, and privacy of the participants who have contributed towards that collection of data, and then publishing the data in the context of your research question and your research project that you've undertaken. That would be a meaningful utilization of your time, the resources, both financial as well as administrative resources that you're looking at undertaking the research for. That is the first part that we need to understand. Now, I'm going to go through this a bit theoretically first, quickly looking at the criteria 2.2 and 2.3, and then look at practically explaining how this would actually happen in the real context. Now, the second criteria talks about understanding the proposed research investigation in accordance with agreed specification and procedure. So this is where what we have to do is, when you decide that I'm going to start this investigation or undertake these series of activities to carry out a research, what we need to be able to do is have a research proposal, or have an outline essentially of the research plan or the project. And this plan or the project that we need to have a outline of tends to be something which helps us define the various activities that we try and do at any given stage when we are looking at undertaking the research. So let me show you this with the example of a research proposal template. The reason I want to do this is because I also want you to understand that when we look at undertaking any form of research, what we would need to do is at some stage create what is called a research specification, or agree that specification and the remit of that research with relevant people. So in this case, when I look at let's say carrying out a research, what I've done is I've created a bit of a template which basically helps us formulate what is called an agreed specification and a procedure, or a process that I will go through for the purposes of carrying out a research. So what I've done is, this particular template basically explains that you start out with a template to highlight the details of your overall, let's put it this way, a superficial view of the research that you're going to carry out. So it's like a macro view of the research that you are proposing to undertake. So you have your name, you have the title and the topic. You have certain basic details, which is to understand why the research is being undertaken. You talk about the aims and objectives. You detail them out in terms of you have one aim and you have 2 or 3 objectives. You detail that out. You put the rationale of the research that you're looking at, why you're looking at undertaking this research. What is the specific area that you want to focus on research? And this is to filter out and ensure that you're minutely looking at the details of what is the research question. So the specific focus of this research will relate to the research question that you're, the main reason why you're looking at undertaking this research. Then you talk about the key issues or points of interest when you undertake this research. What will the research report or the publishing of the research result actually accomplish? What kind of issues or let's say information it will uncover, and what kind of results would it essentially bring out, which will be of use or related to maybe further areas of research or topics that need to be carried out in the future. Maybe a research in the future needs to be carried out. Then you look at providing what areas or what sources you will consider for literature review, what are the published research reports, articles, journals that you will look at, primarily considering and relating, or basically looking at finding out information from. You look at the literature review, and after that you will formulate a research strategy, which will be how would you carry out this research, whether it will be primary research, secondary research. You will go the qualitative route, the quantitative route, what strategy you would put in place, what are the places from which you'll capture or gather information, and then what are the expected results that would come out of this research that you're undertaking. And then we'll also list down certain ethical considerations or boundaries or ethical requirements that you will take into account while you carry out this research. It could be time related, it could be resources, it could be constraints, it could be any areas of conflict, which could be, say, for example, it could be an area of conflict, interest of, conflicts because of the common interest when you're carrying out research. The participant or the result of the research reports can be biased by looking at taking data from certain participants. So all these things are going to be put down. Excuse me. All these things are going to be considered and listed down or put down into what is called the ethical consideration. Now, this bit that I've shown you is a research proposal template, but what it does is it basically puts your research into a particular, format or a structure. And this structure and format, when it is agreed, becomes the agreed remit of why you're carrying out this research in a way. And what are you going to uncover when you carry out this research? What could be the potential results or conclusions that you will draw? And this becomes the research project specification, and most of the agreement is already there on what procedures, processes, how you would go about collecting the data, what and how the data would be analyzed, and what are the processes or procedures which will be followed in terms of completing this research. Essentially is accomplished with this particular template. So towards the end, your main aim would be to be able to measure and come to a meaningful conclusion in terms of why this research was undertaken and what are the findings of this research, which could then be published as a report for readers, for people who are interested in that research to basically read. Now, this leads us to the assessment criteria 2.3, which talks about record and collate data where appropriate. Now, because when we look at undertaking this activity, we are going to be collecting a lot of data. One of the key things that you'll have to look at is there will be a lot of participants. Assuming there are lots of participants in the research that you're undertaking, you are going to be getting a series of data which will need to be recorded. And this data will need to be accurately and consistently recorded in order to ensure that there is no slippage and the data captured is then meaningful, is analyzed meaningfully, and then used to conclude the research, and it helps you in drawing out meaningful conclusions to the research. So when we look at collecting data, when we look at analyzing data, we need to be looking at appropriate tools which are going to help us collect this data in the format that we need. So when we look at primary research and we talk about how data is collected through primary research methods, we talk about 4 or 5 different methods, and these methods typically include interview questionnaires, surveys, focus groups, and for example observations, or which are done. So when, for example, when you're doing laboratory testing, there are lots of observations which are done when you are doing some testing in a pathology lab, or for example when you're testing, say, blood samples, you would be looking at doing observations after an hour. For example, when you go to your GP and you get your blood test done, normally the GP, if they're testing it for type 2 diabetes or any sort of symptoms on diabetes, they're going to ask you to come in empty stomach to be able to give blood. And then 2 hours down the line or an hour down the line, they'll ask you to have something, and then they will take your bloods again. So this is being done in order to systematically understand what was your sugar levels before you had anything, and what are your sugar levels when you've had something to eat. And this would allow them to see whether you're within the tolerance level of having normal sugar, or is your tolerance level over the limit which has been defined, and that would put you or make you susceptible to type 2 diabetes. So in those cases, observations are done, and these are primary methods that are used primarily. These are methods which are used primarily in the case of primary research, because you're trying to collect data firsthand. Now, if you're trying to collect data, secondhand or from secondary sources, that would mean that the data has already been published. And when I say the data has already been published, that means you are collecting information and data from a variety of sources. And these could be sources which are from published reports, articles, journals, government websites, any organizational websites, through the internet. And this would involve you collating existing data which is present in the public domain, and they would be useful for you because you are relating it to your research question or your research hypothesis, and you're going to use that data in your research to come out with meaningful conclusions. So data has to be collected, it has to be recorded, and it has to be collated. So when I talk about data collection and data collation, what we are looking at is using certain analytical tools. So when we talk about analytical tools that we are going to use for research, there could be tools which we generally use on a day-to-day basis. For example, if I've had a questionnaire and there are, multiple choice questions in the questionnaire, and it starts with that, assuming, you have 5 types of answers. So you have very unlikely, you have likely, you have unlikely, you have neutral, and then you have, so you start with, what is called the Likert scale. So you have a negative and a positive response to each question. So you have unlikely, you have likely, you have neutral, you have very likely, and very unlikely. So this would be basically a Likert scale. Now, if you have these kind of things, you might assign, numbers that if you have unlikely, it will be 1. If you're very unlikely, it will be -1. If you have, very likely, it is +1. And if you are neutral, it is 0. Now, this would mean that you'll have to do manual calculation. So in some cases, what we tend to do is we use a lot of data analysis and collection tools. Now, these data analysis and collection tools can be tools like control charts, histograms, scatter diagrams. And in some cases, you can also use software like SPSS, which is statistical package for, analyzing large amounts of data which is collected. You could have NVivo, you could have Atlas, you could have, Kirkos. There are lots of different types of softwares which are currently available, which allow you to analyze the collected data by putting into the software, and that software will then churn out what is called meaningful results in terms of you being able to take decisions from that data. Now, once that data is churned out by the software, at some stage you need to present that data in terms of meaningful findings. And that is where your control charts, your histograms, your bar charts, your tables comes into play, because you're looking at then presenting that data, which is going to make meaningful sense to people or members of the public which are going to read that research. They might not want to get into how you collected the data and what analysis you did and what softwares you did. No, they are more interested in finding out. If I look at a bar chart, if I look at when the government was looking at predicting the peak in COVID, number of cases rising, and then the peak, reaching the peak, that means more hospitalizations gearing up, and the government created makeshift hospitals, 3 or 4 locations like Birmingham and London. And this was done because they were analyzing the data to see when the peak would come. And when the peak would come, they should have enough beds, ICU or ventilators, essentially, to be able to cater and take in patients in order to save lives. And that is what would be the meaningful analysis of data, which is collected from participants or which is coming in from various hospitals, A&Es, and surgeries, and that would help the government to meet the response or provide a strong response, towards the help them provide a strong response toward the COVID pandemic. Now, after this, if I look at giving you what we've discussed is 3 assessment criteria in learning outcome 2. But if I have to now look at giving you real-time examples of what this means, how do we look at implementing research project with agreed specification and procedures? We are looking at formulating a research title. That means this would give us the idea of what the research is all about. It's an overarching headline or a title which basically would say it'll give you an insight into what the research is about or what the report is going to talk about. So some examples are to study the impact of working capital management, to study an assessment of impact of service quality, an assessment of relevance of employer branding in attracting and retaining employees. So when you look at this particular overarching heading or the title, it gives you a good idea in terms of what the research report is going to be all about. Now, when we look at choosing our objectives, we need to make sure that the objectives are minimized to 1 or 2. If it is more than 2 objectives, then your research can be a complex research, which would mean that it will have a larger team and a lot of people involved. Now, generally, when you have 1 or 2 objectives, these objectives very clearly relate to certain aspects of your report in the research. So objective 1 and 2 generally relate to your literature review. That means you're going to go into and understand what are the existing, let's say, material available and the background on which the topic. Say, for example, there's an issue of UK had the highest number of deaths during COVID pandemic in any major developed G7 country. So when you look at this, the first 2 objectives would be to look at analyzing data. And that data would come in from some of the other countries of G7, wherein the proportion of population to the number of deaths which have happened are far lower. So what you're going to be able to do is study the data from the other countries to see why the number of deaths were lower. Now, objective 3 and 4 generally tend to be related to, 3 tends to be related to how you're going to go about carrying out your analysis, a collection of data, whether it's going to be research basis, done basis quantitative, or qualitative aspects of it. And the last objective, if at all you have the objective 4, they will be focused on uncovering, and coming out with findings from the data that you've collected, the research strategy that you've put in place, and the research aims and objectives that you've done when you started out the research. They would then relate to the research findings, essentially. So an example of this would be, if I look at, say, for example, investigation of impact of brand equity on consumer purchase decision, a study of Samsung UK. So here I'm formulating 4 research objectives. The first one talks about critically assess the role of branding in marketing of products. So this is where you would go about collecting existing material to find out what is the role of branding essentially in the marketing of products. And you'll be able to collect that information from Samsung for some of its competitors like LG, Sony, Hisense, things like that. And this particular objective would be related to your literature review. That means you're going into finding out what is present in the market and how this theoretical aspect of branding is related to marketing of products. Then you will look at analyzing the factors impacting consumer purchase intentions of mobile phones. So in this objective, you are now from a very generic role of branding, you're going into a specific product. So the product that you've chosen is mobile phones, and then you're looking at also finding out the purchase intentions. So what you have done is, rather than generically discuss and investigate, role of branding in marketing of products, you have gone into a specific, because you don't want the project to be very huge or very big. What is it that you're looking at specifically, finding out what is the role of branding and how does it affect the consumer purchasing decision or intentions, and that has to be done on a specific product, which is mobile phones. The third and fourth objectives looks at investigating the impact of brand equity, and basically looks at what recommendations that you can then make towards the end as a conclusion by carrying out this research. So as you can see, I've created an example of a research topic, which is the headline of the title. And then I've put 4 topics in. Topic 1 and 2 are related to research in terms of literature review. And then 3 and 4 are specifically focused on you carrying out the research. So your main aim is to look at finding out what is the impact of brand equity on consumer purchase intentions of Samsung. This is your main reason of carrying out your research. And whether you go about doing qualitative or quantitative research, this will be related to your objective 3. And then the findings of your research would essentially relate to what is called objective 4. That means you're going to make recommendations of how Samsung should look at studying consumer purchase intentions, specifically related to brand and branding decisions, and how that would help in increasing the product sales of its mobile phones. And then when I go about, say, for example, essentially getting into a bit more detail, I look at literature review. So here, what I'm going to do is look at referred journal articles. I look at conference papers. I look at some edited or peer-reviewed, work which has been published in articles and journals. I look at publications, textbooks, and this would help me then uncover what is called the existence of, the present literature which is available related to the research activity I'm carrying out. Now, the second bit that I would look at is when I look at carrying out literature review, I'm going to be focused on basically looking at what is the existing review of what I'm reading telling me about. Who has written it? How old is it? And how does it help me address my research objectives? Now, if it was a research carried out that you're reading and is a report which was published 10 years back, things would have changed, and that might not be relevant for you today. So obviously, when you carry out any sort of analysis in terms of existing literature, you need to make sure that what is the sanctity of that research, who has written it, who has authored it, and how long back was it produced, and whether it's of any relevance in today's time and context. Then in some cases, when we look at formulating a hypothesis, we have to create a conceptual framework. So your objectives have been formulated into and related to the important areas that you're going to go about investigating in the research. And when we look at purchase intentions, they can be influenced by brand awareness, brand loyalty, brand association, and the perceived quality of the product. So in this case, you are looking at taking into account the main pillars that you're going to be looking at studying, and how would they relate to your main objective, which is the impact of brand equity on consumer purchase intentions of Samsung. So this would help you create what is called a conceptual framework. Now, for the purposes of this particular unit and carrying out research and understanding this in more detail, I have a book which is available on Moodle, and this is Research Methods, or a book written by Saunders and his team. which is considered a Bible if somebody is looking at undertaking a research, and this is a must read. Now, this is a typical academic book of 400-500 pages, but there are some chapters in this book that you would need to read in order to understand how to look at undertaking a research, how to create a research specification, how do you look at structuring your research report. And those are going to be good chapters that if you read them, they will help you crystallize some of the discussions that we are doing and help build your knowledge and understanding on how to go about carrying out research. Now, I did share an article on Research Onion yesterday, and I did mention there are these 3 different circles which was proposed as a methodology, and this is now widely known as the Research Onion by Saunders, and this particular bit was proposed by Saunders and his team. Now, first we look at basically the theoretical approaches that we would look at primarily in terms of how do we want to carry out research. So there are 3 main circles that we would look at in the Research Onion. And these 3 main circles tend to be the first outer ring, which is going to be talking about research philosophy and approach. The second one talking about, the research strategy. And the third one talking about how do you go about collecting data, how much time you would spend on collecting and analyzing this data. And then towards the end, what you do is basically present your findings by tabulating or compiling a report. Now, I won't go into details, but because what we wanted to look at is be able to, for this particular learning outcome, what we want to be able to do is go about understanding how, the research is done and how you create a plan for the implementation of your research, how do you collect data, and then how you analyze data. So these slides basically focus on detailing out the topic which I shared with you yesterday, which is on Research Onion, which is nothing but the research methodology, the strategy and the approach that you're going to take to be able to then go about carrying out your research. And they tend to be defined, whether you're going to go into primary research, that means you're going to collect data firsthand, or you're going to go into secondary research, which means you look at collecting data from various sources, but this would be without direct interaction with the participants. So these bits have to be done in terms of deciding your research strategy and the approach that you're going to take to be able to undertake investigation into the research and, the ways that you will go about conducting a research. Now, there are lots of different types of data collection that can be done. As I mentioned, primary research methods and the secondary research methods. And these are the methods which I've listed here. Now, towards the end, our aim is to understand what is collected, how is it collated, and how it is analyzed. Now, one of the common mistakes that I do see that researchers do is that they worry too much that I do not have enough data. And sometimes they worry about that, how do I go about collecting the data, or when I've collected it, how do I go about analyzing my data? So this part of it is essentially covered in what is called data analysis. Now, data analysis techniques will depend on what your research question is and your research approach is. Now, if your research question is going to use, for example, let's say an inductive approach or a deductive approach, and basis that you would carry out, say, qualitative, analysis, which is going to be inductive, and if you're going to carry out quantitative, which is going to be deductive, then your data analysis would depend on how you would use these approaches to basically analyze the data. So in this case, when we look at analyzing the data, there are 2 main techniques which are generally used. One is quantitative, that means numerical, statistical data. So here you're looking at your key variables, you're looking at the relationship between the variable. When I say independent and dependent variable, then what you're looking at is trying to establish a relationship between the two and then come out with a conclusion. Now, if it is going to be quantitative, then you're going to be looking at the data which has been collected in terms of the number of questionnaires which have been collected, number of participants which have contributed towards that collection of data. And this is where you would require tabulation software to be able to carry out analysis, because the data collected is vast and you don't want to make mistakes in terms of tabulating and analyzing the data. And that is where the use of statistical tools comes into play, and you use that to carry out and come out with meaningful, let's say, numbers. An example of raw data which is collected from a survey. So, for example, you've gone in, you had a questionnaire which basically said what is your age, and you have age groups defined as 18 to 25, 26 to 30, 31 to 35, 36 to 40. So you have so many different types of age groups. Then you have male, female, you have ethnicity, whether you're Asian, European, British, American, Chinese, South Asian, whether you're salaried, unsalaried, you're employed, self-employed, unemployed. Your salaries between 25,000 to 30,000, 35 to 45, 45 to 50. So what you've done is, when you have such complex data to be analyzed, and there could be very many different types of permutation combinations, you would need statistical tools to be able to collate, analyze, and then interpret that data. And that is normally done when you're doing quantitative, that means numerical, statistics, numbers related collection of data. And that is where you look at statistical tools like SPSS. We talk about, when we talk about SPSS in general, we are looking at, this is statistical software essentially, which basically is, used for analyzing data which is collected. And then you can use regression analysis. You can use various techniques to be able to then, correlation analysis to basically try and test your hypothesis. Now, testing of hypothesis is normally done because you are going to either prove the data that you've collected will either prove that your research that you've carried out and the problems or issues that you're facing are correct, or it'll either disprove that, this is not correct and this is something which is not backed up theoretically. So in those cases, these tools are going to be useful for you to be able to analyze your data. Now, when I look at qualitative data analysis, we are looking at, meaning, context, process, and reasoning. So qualitative data analysis would essentially mean that when you look at, if I put it this way, that if I look at qualitative analysis data and the tools that we have, in those cases, generally what we are going to be focused on is understanding that what would be the process of organizing, analyzing, and interpreting non-numeric data. And this would generally be based on your conceptual information and the user feedback, and in some ways, or it'll relate to your conceptual framework that you've created in order to carry out the research. So when we look at, say, for example, some of the techniques that we use for the purposes of qualitative data analysis, we're going to be looking at, some sort of groupings, and these groupings would primarily be either say, for example, will come from either some sort of meaningful context. They will be looking at some sort of reasoning, and they would be following some sort of, process or grounded theory, let's put it this way, over the years through which you will be looking at collecting this data. Now, qualitative data analysis is generally done when you're trying to identify themes. That means you're trying to look at trends. You're trying to look at predicting trends. And this would mean that you're looking at managing the data in terms so that the data part of it can be reduced, and you are able to then use that data in groups to be able to predict trends or themes that are going to emerge from research. So qualitative data analysis tends to be based on open-ended questionnaires. It will not be closed-ended questionnaires. Closed-ended questionnaires is, if I ask you a question, are you a male or female? So you are going to choose either male or female. That's a closed-ended questionnaire. So if I ask you a question, what is your sex? Then in this case, this is an open-ended question because I could have various answers to it. I would say I'm male. I could also say I'm a female. I could also say do not want to answer. I could also say, so there could be many answers. In this case, you are not able to assign very specific answers to those questions. And in those cases, they would be termed as open-ended questions. So if I say a question, what is your salary? And I give you 4 choices, 25 to 35, 35 to 45, 45 to 55, and over 55. So what I've done in this case is I've asked you to choose one of the choices which have been given in the question. But if I say, what is your salary? And I put a blank there, and I put a blank to say, you mention it, then in that case, this is an open-ended question, because you could choose to say not applicable. You might not answer that question. You might leave it blank. You might also put a number down which does not, which is something which is your actual salary, or you might put a number down in the region what your salary is, because you're not comfortable disclosing it. So that would be an open-ended questionnaire. And then we are looking at data interpretation. That means data that has been collected. Sometimes you have questionnaires which are incomplete, not all responses are there, or multiple responses to the same question have been mentioned, and that could skew your findings. So in those cases, what you do is you ignore those questionnaires or ignore that particular data from that participant, in order to ensure that your results that you compile towards the end are not biased, or are not going towards a particular are not going to give you, let's say, they're not going to be biased essentially. So sometimes you have to weed out the questionnaires which tend to be either are incomplete, have multiple choices mentioned or multiple questions mentioned, or in some cases not have been answered properly, or have been incompletely answered, which does not allow you to take them into for the purposes of let's say collating your data. Now, towards the end, what you do is you interpret the data. Your aim is to look at coming out with tables, diagrams, graphs, which will basically pictorially and visually show the results of your finding. And that tends to be data interpretation. Data interpretation will also take into account what has been uncovered because of the investigation or the research that you have done. How does it relate to your research question, objectives, and the literature review? And this tends to be data interpretation. So you compare and contrast your findings with the existing literature review that you carried out earlier. You then relate it to your aims and objectives of the research that you started out with. And towards the end, you draw out meaningful conclusions which have come out from the analysis of your data, and then put them out as conclusions for the members of public or for your readers to be able to take into account. And this is how you would look at, implementing a research project, by looking at collecting data, by analyzing data, and then coming out with meaningful conclusions towards the end in order to present your research report. Now, for today's topic, I would suggest that you look at reading the chapter 2 of the book, which is going to be available on Moodle by Saunders, and that would help you crystallize your understanding today on how do we go about implementing a research project, and what and how do we draw up a research specification or a proposal or an outline for the research, and then how do we go about carrying them in the broad 5 sections that we've discussed, things like literature review, research methodology, which is research onion, and then look at data collection and analysis, and towards the end we will look at discussing conclusions. So any questions on today's discussion, feel free to ask me now. And you can also ask or send me questions through email, and would then be happy to catch up with you next week on Learning Outcome 3, which will be on Tuesday, and Learning Outcome 4, which will be on Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining, and bye for now.